She bought a mansion to outrun her grief. But the house remembered what she forgot. Behind a locked nursery door slept a secret. And $80 million that would test her soul. If you found a fortune buried in sorrow, would you keep it or let the truth set you free? The auction hall smelled like old paper and regret. Margaret Hartley sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, watching the auctioneer gesture toward a projection screen showing photographs of a mansion that looked more like a monument to neglect than a home. Ashwood Estate. Built 1952, coastal Maine. 5 bedrooms, ocean views. Abandoned for 40 years, the images cycled through peeling paint, broken windows, vines strangling the chimneys. The kind of place people drove past and called haunted. The kind of place Margaret needed. Starting bid is $200,000, the auctioneer called. His voice echoed in the half-empty room. Silence. Margaret's chest tightened. She had $180,000, every penny from the life insurance payout after Thomas died. The money she was supposed to use for retirement, for travel, for all the things they'd planned and would never do. Instead, she was here, betting everything on a house that was falling apart. Just like her. 180, she said, her voice barely carrying. The auctioneer squinted at her. Ma'am, the minimum is... 180 is all I have. A pause. The room shifted uncomfortably. Then the auctioneer shrugged. Going once, twice. The gavel came down. Sold. Margaret signed the papers with numb fingers. The clerk handed her a set of keys that felt heavier than they should. And just like that, she owned a mansion she'd never seen in person. The drive north took 4 hours. Margaret followed the coastline, watching the ocean churn gray and restless beneath a sky the color of old bone. The trees grew thicker as she left the highway, their branches curving over the road like skeletal fingers. She hadn't told anyone she was leaving. Her sister had stopped calling after the funeral, tired of Margaret's silence. Her friends had drifted away, uncomfortable with grief that lasted longer than courtesy allowed. Thomas had been gone for 9 months, and Margaret had spent every one of them suffocating in the house they'd shared, surrounded by his clothes, his books, his coffee mug still sitting on the counter because she couldn't bring herself to put it away. She needed to leave. Needed to be somewhere Thomas had never been, where his absence didn't scream from every corner. The GPS lost signal 20 minutes before she reached the estate. Margaret followed handwritten directions on the back of the auction receipt, turning onto a narrow dirt road that wound through dense pine forest. And then the trees opened up. The mansion rose from the landscape like something out of a Gothic novel. 3 stories of weathered stone and rotting wood, perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. The paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing raw timber beneath. Windows gaped dark and empty. Ivy covered the east wing so completely it looked like the house was being slowly devoured. But it was still standing. Margaret parked in the circular driveway, overgrown with weeds, and stepped out into the salt-heavy air. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the distant crash of waves against rock. She walked to the front door, her shoes crunching on gravel. The porch groaned under her weight. The door itself was massive oak, carved with symbols she didn't recognize, the brass handle tarnished green. The key slid in smoothly. The lock turned with a sound like something waking up. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Dust motes hung suspended in the shafts of light, falling through broken windows. The entrance hall stretched deep into the house, lined with doors that stood half open, like mouths caught mid-sentence. Margaret set down her suitcase and walked forward slowly. The floor was marble, cracked but intact. A chandelier hung crooked from the ceiling, crystals dulled by decades of neglect. To her left, a grand staircase curved upward into shadow. She ran her hand along the banister. The wood was solid beneath the grime. "Okay," she whispered. To herself, to Thomas, to the house. "We can do this." Her voice disappeared into the silence. She spent the first hour exploring the ground floor, a sitting room with furniture covered in sheets, a kitchen with a rusted stove, a library where books had swelled and rotted on their shelves. Every room felt like a held breath. By the time the sun began to set, Margaret had set up a makeshift bed in the sitting room, closest to the fireplace. She lit candles the electricity had been shut off years ago and ate a sandwich she'd packed, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. The house settled around her. Creaks and groans, the language of old wood and stone. She pulled a photograph from her coat pocket. Thomas, grinning at the camera, his arm around her shoulders, taken 3 years ago at the harbor. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered to the image. But I couldn't stay there anymore. The candlelight flickered. Margaret tucked the photo away and stood. She needed to see the rest of the house before it got too dark. She took a candle and climbed the stairs. The second floor was colder. Margaret moved down the hallway, opening doors. Bedrooms, mostly empty. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub. Another sitting room, smaller, with a view of the ocean. And at the end of the hall, a door that was different. It had been painted over thick, deliberate coats of white that had cracked and yellowed with age. A chain was looped through the handle, padlocked from the outside, and mounted at eye level a small brass plaque. Emily's room, 1978. Margaret's pulse quickened. She knelt, bringing the candle close to the gap beneath the door. Cold air seeped out, carrying the faint scent of something old and forgotten. And there, just visible in the flickering light, a small white shoe, child-sized, lying on its side just inside the door. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the padlock. It was rusted shut, but tomorrow she'd find a way to open it. Because something in that room had been waiting, and Margaret had the terrible feeling it had been waiting for her. Margaret woke to the sound of gulls screaming over the cliffs. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the cold seeped in the hard floor beneath her sleeping bag, the smell of salt and decay, the weight of emptiness pressing down from the floors above. Ashwood Estate. Her house now. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on marble. Gray light filtered through the broken windows, painting everything in shades of ash. The locked door upstairs pulled at her thoughts like a splinter she couldn't ignore. Emily's room. Margaret made instant coffee on a camp stove and wrapped her hands around the tin cup for warmth. She thought about the child's shoe she'd seen through the gap beneath the door. White leather, small enough to fit in her palm. Why lock a child's room from the outside? Why leave it sealed for 40 years? She spent the morning exploring the house more thoroughly. In the kitchen, she found dishes still stacked in the sink, crusted with residue from a meal never finished. A calendar hung on the wall, its pages yellowed and brittle, frozen on July 1978. Someone had circled a date, July 15th. Beside it, in faded ink, Emily's birthday party. Margaret touched the page gently. It crumbled at the edges. Upstairs, the master bedroom was vast and cold. The bed was still made, though the linens had rotted to lace. A wardrobe stood open, revealing dresses from another era, silks and wools, carefully hung, as if the owner had simply stepped away and planned to return. But she never had. Margaret moved through the room, opening drawers, searching for something, anything that might explain why this family had abandoned their home so completely. In the vanity, beneath a layer of dust and broken cosmetics, she found a jewelry box. Rosewood, delicate, the kind meant for treasures. She opened it carefully. Inside, tangled in a nest of tarnished chains, was a single brass key. Margaret's breath caught. She held it up to the light. It was small, old, the kind that might fit a padlock, the kind that might open Emily's door. She drove into town that afternoon, following a 2-lane road that wound through pine forest before opening onto a main street lined with weathered storefronts. The library was a small brick building tucked between a hardware store and a cafe. Inside, it smelled like old paper and lemon polish. An elderly woman sat behind the circulation desk, knitting something long and blue. She looked up as Margaret entered, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You're the one who bought Ashwood Estate," the woman said. Not a question. Margaret hesitated. "How did you—" "Small town. Word travels." The woman set down her knitting. "I'm Dorothy Winslow. I've been the librarian here for 43 years. If you're looking for the history of that house, I can help." Margaret stepped closer. "I'd appreciate that." Dorothy disappeared into the stacks and returned with a file box, old and dented. She set it on the table between them and opened it carefully. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. "Victor Ashwood," Dorothy said, pulling out a black and white photograph. "Shipping magnate, built the estate in 1952. Married Catherine Marsh the same year. They had one daughter, Emily." She slid another photo across the table. A little girl with dark curls and a bright smile, standing beside a reflecting pool. Margaret's chest tightened. "What happened to her?" Dorothy's expression softened. "Drowned. July 16th, 1978. Day after her 7th birthday. The reflecting pool behind the house, she wandered out there alone. By the time they found her, it was too late." Margaret stared at the photograph. The girl's eyes were wide and joyful, unaware of what was coming. "The family left immediately," Dorothy continued. "Victor, Catherine, their son just packed what they could carry and disappeared. The house was locked up. No one's been inside since. Until you—" "They had a son?" "David. He was 14 when it happened. I heard he lives somewhere down south now. Never came back." Margaret absorbed this slowly. A family shattered by tragedy. A house abandoned in grief. She understood that instinct. "Why would they lock Emily's room?" Margaret asked quietly. Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. "Grief does strange things to people. Maybe they couldn't bear to see it. Maybe they wanted to preserve it exactly as she left it." She paused. "Or maybe they were locking something in." Margaret returned to the mansion as the sun dipped toward the horizon. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, the brass key heavy in her pocket. The hallway was darker now, the shadows deeper. She stood before Emily's door, her hand trembling as she reached for the padlock. The key slid in smoothly. The lock clicked open. Margaret unwound the chain and let it fall to the floor with a dull clang. She placed her hand on the doorknob. It was cold, colder than the air around it. And then she heard it. A sound from inside the room. Soft, deliberate. The creak of weight shifting on old floorboards. Margaret froze. The house was empty. She knew it was empty. But something in that room had just moved. She turned the handle slowly. The door swung open, and the smell hit her first lavender and dust, preserved like a memory. The room was frozen in time. A small bed with a patchwork quilt, toys on shelves, drawings pinned to the walls in careful rows. And in the corner, behind a child-sized rocking chair, a shape covered by a canvas tarp. Margaret stepped inside, her pulse pounding. She crossed the room slowly, her footsteps muffled by the old carpet. She reached for the tarp and pulled it away. Beneath it sat a safe, heavy, iron. old-fashioned, with a combination lock. And carved into the wall above it, barely visible in the dim light, were words scratched into the plaster. "Forgive me. This was never meant to be hers." Margaret's hands shook as she knelt before the safe. She didn't know what was inside, but she had the terrible feeling that whatever it was, it had been waiting for her all along. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the safe, about the message scratched above it. "Forgive me. This was never meant to be hers." What did Victor Ashwood hide in his daughter's room? And why did it feel like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to find out? She returned to Emily's room at dawn. The door stood open now, no longer sealed. Pale light filtered through the window, painting the preserved space in shades of gray and gold. Margaret moved slowly, taking in the details she'd missed the night before. The bed was small, neatly made, the quilt embroidered with butterflies. A shelf held a collection of porcelain dolls, their glass eyes following her movements. Drawings covered one-wall crayon sketches of the ocean, the mansion, a family of 3 holding hands. Emily had been an artist. Margaret's throat tightened. She crossed to the safe and knelt before it, running her fingers over the iron surface. It was old, heavy, the kind built to withstand fire and time. The combination lock was rusted but intact. She tried the obvious combinations first. Emily's birthday, the 12th of March, 2071. Nothing. The year the house was built, 1952. Nothing. The year Emily died, 1978. Nothing. Margaret sat back, frustrated. She looked around the room again, searching for clues. That's when she noticed the bookshelf. It stood against the far wall, filled with children's books, worn spines, faded covers. But something about it felt wrong. Margaret stood and walked over, running her hand along the edge. The shelf didn't sit flush with the wall. There was a gap, barely visible, but there. She knocked on the wall behind the shelf. Hollow. Her pulse quickened. Margaret gripped the shelf and pulled. It was heavier than it looked, but it moved, sliding forward on hidden wheels, revealing a panel behind it. The panel was seamless, painted to match the wall, but there, at eye level, was a small brass latch. Margaret pressed it. The panel swung inward. Behind it was a narrow closet, no more than 3 feet deep. And inside the closet, mounted to the back wall, was another compartment, a hidden alcove built into the structure of the house itself. The safe sat inside, tucked away where no one would ever think to look, unless they knew it was there. Margaret stared at it, her mind racing. Victor Ashwood had hidden this, deliberately, professionally. Not from strangers, from his own family. She spent the next 2 days searching the house for answers. In Victor's study on the first floor, she found filing cabinets filled with business records, shipping manifests, contracts, invoices from decades past. Most of it was mundane, but buried at the bottom of one drawer, she found a folder marked Private. Inside were letters, correspondence between Victor and a man named Richard Caldwell, dated between 1975 and 1978. Margaret read them carefully, piecing together fragments of a story. Victor had been involved in international shipping, luxury goods, antiques, high-value cargo. But the letters hinted at something else. Transactions that weren't recorded. Shipments that never appeared on manifests. One letter, dated March 1977, made Margaret's stomach turn. Victor, the arrangement is secure. The nursery insurance remains our best guarantee. No one will look there. Continue as planned. R.C. The nursery insurance. No cobwebs. No dust-covered boxes or forgotten junk. Just an empty wooden floor, swept clean. And in the center, directly beneath the window, sat a large leather travel trunk. It was old, the kind with brass corners and heavy buckles, the leather darkened with age but well cared for. The kind of trunk someone would take on a long journey and never want to lose. Claire's breath caught. She moved toward it slowly, her footsteps creaking on the old boards. The trunk was locked with a combination padlock, 4 brass dials worn smooth from use, and resting on top of the trunk, held down by a small stone, was a folded piece of paper. Claire's heart pounded as she picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakably Robert's neat, careful, the way he signed birthday cards and grocery lists. It said simply, "For Claire, when you're ready." She sank to her knees, the note trembling in her hands. Robert had been up here. Not once, but many times. Judging by how clean everything was, he'd kept this space, preserved it, hidden it from her for 40 years. And he'd left something for her to find. Claire stared at the trunk, her mind spinning. What could be inside? What had her husband, the man she'd shared a life with, a bed with, 1,000 ordinary mornings with, kept locked away all this time? Part of her wanted to climb back down, to leave it sealed, to let the past stay buried. But another part of her, the part that had spent 6 months asking questions no one could answer, needed to know. She reached for the lock, her fingers hovering over the dials. The combination. What would Robert have chosen? Margaret sat on the floor of Emily's room, the journal open in her lap, reading by the pale light filtering through the window. Catherine's handwriting grew more frantic with each entry. The 22nd of April 1977. Victor is lying to me. I know he is. The shipping contracts don't match the manifests. There are transactions he won't explain. When I asked about the gold, he told me it was collateral. Insurance against risk. But whose risk? And why hide it in our daughter's room? The 8th of May, 1977. I followed him to the docks tonight. He met with men I didn't recognize. They spoke in low voices, handed him envelopes. Victor looked afraid. I've never seen him afraid before. The 19th of December, 1977. He's stealing from them. His partners, his clients, everyone who trusted him. The gold isn't insurance. It's what he's taken. And now he's hiding it here, where no one would ever think to look. In Emily's room, in our daughter's room. Margaret's hands trembled. She turned to the final pages. The 15th of July, 1978. Emily turned 7 today. We had a party by the pool. She was so happy. I watched her laugh, and all I could think was, how long until your father destroys us all? The 16th of July, 1978. Emily is gone. I can't write the words without breaking. Victor says it's not his fault. Says the gold had nothing to do with it. But I know better. I know that everything we've touched since he brought it into this house has turned to poison. He wants to leave. Run. Take the gold and disappear. But I told him the gold stays here, buried with everything else we lost. Let it rot in this room. Let anyone who finds it carry the weight we carried. Margaret closed the journal, her vision blurred with tears. Catherine had cursed this fortune, and Margaret had opened it anyway. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and looked back at the safe. The gold bars gleamed faintly in the shadows, rows of them, stacked with precision, each one stamped with markings she didn't fully understand. Margaret reached in and pulled one bar free. It was cold, heavy, real. She turned it over in her hands, studying the engravings, serial numbers, purity marks, and something else, a small stamp she hadn't noticed before. Caldwell Maritime, 1976. Her breath caught. Caldwell. The name from Victor's letters. This wasn't just stolen gold. It was stolen from a specific person. A business partner who'd trusted Victor Ashwood and been betrayed. Margaret set the bar down carefully and reached deeper into the safe. There, beneath the gold, were documents. Shipping manifests, contracts, and a ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten entries detailing transactions that had never been reported. Margaret flipped through the pages, her heart pounding. And then she saw it. A contract dated August 1977. At the bottom, 2 signatures. Victor Ashwood and Thomas Hartley. Margaret's world tilted. She stared at the name, her husband's name, written in ink that had faded but was still unmistakably his. No, she whispered. It couldn't be. Thomas had been an accountant. A quiet, honest man who'd spent his life doing taxes and helping small businesses balance their books. He'd never mentioned Victor Ashwood, never mentioned shipping, never mentioned gold. But his name was here, on a document tied to theft and fraud and a child's death. Margaret's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the ledger. She flipped forward, searching for more, and found another entry, dated June 1978, 1 month before Emily died. Final audit complete. Discrepancies noted and sealed. T.H. Thomas had known. He'd audited Victor's books, found the theft, and then... What? Had he been complicit? Had he helped Victor hide it? Or had he tried to stop it? Margaret sank to the floor, the ledger clutched against her chest. All these months, she'd been running from Thomas's absence, from the grief that swallowed her whole. But now she was running toward something worse. The possibility that the man she'd loved, the man she'd mourned, had been part of something terrible. Her phone buzzed. Margaret jumped, her heart racing. She pulled the phone from her pocket with shaking hands. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Hello? Margaret Hartley? The voice was male, older, cold. Yes. Who is this? My name is David Ashwood. Margaret's stomach dropped. I heard someone bought the estate, he continued. Heard you've been restoring it. How did you... Small town. Word travels. His tone was sharp. I'm calling because I need to know. Have you found anything unusual in the house? Margaret's pulse hammered. She looked at the safe, at the gold bars gleaming in the dim light. What do you mean? A pause. Then, my father hid something in that house. Something dangerous. If you found it, you need to know it doesn't belong to you. I don't understand. The gold, David said flatly. He hid gold, stolen gold, and people have died trying to keep it secret. Margaret's throat tightened. Died? My sister, my mother. Eventually grief killed her. And your husband. The words hit like a blow. What? Thomas Hartley. He was the one who discovered what my father was doing. He was going to report it, and then he died. Sudden car accident, they said. David's voice hardened, but I never believed it. Margaret's vision blurred. You're saying... I'm saying that gold is cursed. It's taken everyone who touched it, and if you found it, you're next. The line went dead. Margaret sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Thomas. He hadn't been complicit. He'd been trying to stop it, and it had killed him. She looked back at the safe, at the fortune that had been hidden for 40 years. The gold gleamed in the shadows. Beautiful, deadly, and hers. Margaret didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table through the night, the gold bar in front of her, Thomas's photograph beside it. The metal gleamed under the weak light of her lantern. Cold, heavy, beautiful. $80 million. Enough to restore the mansion, pay off every debt, live comfortably for the rest of her life. All she had to do was keep it. But every time she looked at the gold, she saw Thomas's signature on that contract, saw the date, 1 month before he died. He was going to report it. And someone had stopped him. Margaret's hands trembled as she picked up the bar. It was so heavy it hurt to hold. She thought about what David Ashwood had said. People have died trying to keep it secret. She set the bar down with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the empty house. Margaret met David at a cafe in town the next morning. He was waiting for her in a corner booth, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Late 40s, graying at the temples, with the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. He looked up as she approached. Margaret Hartley. She nodded and slid into the seat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then David said, "You found it." "Yes, and you know what it is. Stolen gold, hidden by your grandfather." David's jaw tightened. "My grandfather was a thief and a coward. He destroyed my family, and when my sister died, he just ran, left everything behind. The gold, the guilt, all of it." Margaret studied him. "Your mother, Catherine, she wrote about it, in her journal." David's expression softened slightly. "She kept a journal?" "She left it in the safe, with the gold." He closed his eyes briefly. What did it say? That she blamed the gold for Emily's death. That she told your grandfather to leave it there, to let it rot. David was quiet for a long moment. "Then, my mother never recovered. She left my father when I was 16. Took me with her. We never spoke about what happened. She died 5 years ago, still carrying it." Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." David looked at her directly. "I didn't ask you here for sympathy. I asked because I need your help." "With what?" "Returning the gold. To whoever it belongs to. Or at least, making it right." Margaret's pulse quickened. "You don't want it?" "Want it?" David's laugh was bitter. "That gold killed my sister, destroyed my family. I don't want it anywhere near me. But I've spent years trying to figure out where it came from, who my grandfather stole it from. And I've hit dead ends everywhere." He leaned forward. "But now you have access to the house. To the documents. You can help me trace it. Make restitution." Margaret looked down at her hands. "What if I kept it?" David didn't flinch. "Then you'd be no different than he was." The words hit like a slap. Margaret's vision blurred. She thought about Thomas. About the kind of man he'd been. Honest. Principled. The kind who'd report fraud even when it put him at risk. The kind who'd died because of it. "My husband tried to stop your grandfather," she said quietly. David nodded. "I know. I looked into his death after I found out he'd audited my grandfather's books. The accident report said brake failure, but the car had been serviced 2 days before. It didn't make sense." "You think someone—" "I think my grandfather had connections. People who didn't want the truth coming out." David's voice hardened. "Your husband was a good man, Margaret. He tried to do the right thing. And it cost him everything." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. She thought about the gold sitting in Emily's room. About the weight of it. The way it seemed to pull at her, whispering promises of security and comfort. But it wasn't hers. It had never been hers. "I'll help you," she said. David exhaled slowly. "Thank you." Margaret returned to the mansion in the late afternoon. The house felt different, heavier. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. When she reached Emily's room, she stopped. The door was open. She'd closed it when she left. Margaret's pulse hammered. She stepped inside slowly. The safe was open. Gold bars were missing. She could see the gaps where they'd been stacked. 3, maybe 4. And on the floor, leading from the safe to the hallway, were muddy footprints. Boot prints. Large. Recent. Someone had been here. Margaret's breath came fast and shallow. She spun, scanning the room. That's when she saw the note. It was lying on Emily's bed, written on a torn piece of paper in blocky handwriting. "You should have taken the deal when you had the chance. R." Margaret's hands shook as she picked it up. R. Richard Caldwell. The man Victor had stolen from. He was still alive. And he knew she had the gold. Margaret heard a sound downstairs, a door closing softly. Her heart stopped. Someone was in the house. Margaret stood frozen in Emily's room, the note crumpled in her hand. The sound downstairs came again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the first floor. Someone was searching. Margaret's heart hammered. She looked at the open safe, at the gold still stacked inside, and made a decision. She couldn't stay here. She grabbed her phone and moved silently to the hallway, pressing herself against the wall. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice, muffled but clear. "Check upstairs." Margaret didn't wait. She ran. Down the hall, into the master bedroom, locking the door behind her. Her hands shook as she dialed 911. "Police. What's your emergency?" "Someone's in my house. Ashwood Estate. Off Route 7. Please." "Ma'am, are you in immediate danger?" "Yes. They're inside. They broke in." "Stay on the line. Officers are on the way." Margaret crouched behind the bed, her breath ragged, listening. The footsteps climbed the stairs. The police arrived 20 minutes later. By then, whoever had been inside was gone. The officers searched the house, found the muddy boot prints, the open safe. But there was no forced entry. No broken windows. No signs of violence. One of the officers, a young man with tired eyes, looked at Margaret skeptically. "Ma'am, you said someone stole gold from your house?" Margaret hesitated. "Yes, from a safe, in the nursery." "And how much gold are we talking about?" She couldn't say it, couldn't explain. "Several bars. Valuable." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Do you have proof of ownership? Documentation?" Margaret's stomach sank. "No." "Then how do you know it was stolen and not just moved?" "Because I didn't move it." The officer sighed. "Look, we'll file a report, but without evidence of forced entry or proof that the gold was yours to begin with, there's not much we can do." After they left, Margaret sat on the porch steps, her head in her hands. She couldn't prove anything, and the gold was disappearing. She called David. He answered on the second ring. "Margaret? What happened?" "Someone broke in, took some of the gold, left a note signed R." A pause. Then, "Richard Caldwell. Who is he?" "My grandfather's business partner, the one he stole from." David's voice was grim. "He's in his 80s now, but he never stopped looking. Never stopped believing Victor hid the gold somewhere. He knows I have it." "Then you're in danger. Caldwell's not a good man, Margaret. He's spent 40 years obsessing over this. He won't stop until he has it all." Margaret closed her eyes. "What do I do?" "Get out of that house. Now. I'll come to you." David arrived the next morning with a private investigator, a woman named Elena Ramos, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. They sat in the mansion's kitchen, the remaining gold bars spread across the table like evidence at a crime scene. Elena examined them carefully. "These are stamped with Caldwell Maritime. 1,976. If we can prove Victor Ashwood embezzled these from Caldwell's company, we have a case for restitution. But we'd have to turn them over, Margaret said quietly. Yes. Margaret looked at the gold, at the fortune that could have saved her. What about my husband, Thomas Hartley? He audited Victor's books, found the theft, and then he died. Elena's expression softened. You think it was connected? David does, and so do I. Elena made notes. If we can prove that, it changes everything. It's not just embezzlement. It's conspiracy. Maybe even murder. Margaret's throat tightened. How do we prove it? We find his files, his notes, anything he left behind. Margaret searched the house that afternoon, looking for anything Thomas might have hidden. She'd been through their old home after he died, packed up his office, donated his books, but she'd never found anything unusual. Now she wondered if she'd missed something. In the mansion's library, tucked behind a row of rotting books, she found a loose panel in the wall. Behind it was a metal box. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were Thomas's files, audit reports, notes, and a letter, dated the 20th of June, 1978, 1 week before he died. Margaret unfolded it with shaking hands. To whom it may concern, my name is Thomas Hartley, and I am writing this as a record of what I've discovered. Victor Ashwood has been embezzling from Caldwell Maritime for at least 3 years. The total value of stolen assets exceeds $80 million. I have documented evidence, which I am prepared to submit to federal authorities. I am writing this because I believe my life may be in danger. Victor has threatened me, told me to stay silent, but I cannot. If something happens to me, let this letter serve as proof that I tried to do the right thing. Thomas Hartley. Margaret's vision blurred. He'd known. He'd tried to stop it. And they'd killed him for it. If you've been following her story this far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because what happens next will show you that even in darkness, honesty is the light that leads us home. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in Emily's room, the journal in her lap, reading Catherine's final entries again. Emily's death wasn't an accident. I was distracted, angry. I confronted Victor that morning, screamed at him about the gold, and while we fought, Emily wandered outside, alone. By the time I realized she was gone, it was too late. I killed her, not the gold. Me. But I let Victor believe it was the gold. Let him carry that guilt, because I couldn't carry it alone. Margaret closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Catherine had spent her life believing she'd failed her daughter, just like Margaret had spent months believing she'd failed Thomas. But Thomas hadn't needed saving. He'd been trying to save everyone else, and it had cost him everything. Margaret stood slowly. She looked at the gold, still stacked in the safe, and she knew what she had to do. The next morning, Margaret called the FBI. She explained everything: the gold, Victor's theft, Thomas's letter, Catherine's journal. The agent on the other end listened carefully. We'll send someone. Don't touch anything. Don't let anyone else near it. How long? 2 hours. Margaret hung up and exhaled slowly. It was done. She was giving it all up. But before the agents could arrive, a car pulled into the driveway. Black. Expensive. Margaret's stomach dropped. 3 men stepped out. One of them was old, stooped, leaning on a cane. Richard Caldwell. He walked to the front door and knocked. Margaret didn't answer. Mrs. Hartley, Caldwell called. His voice was rough, strained. I know you're in there, and I know you have my gold. Margaret stood behind the door, her hand gripping a crowbar she'd found in the garage. I'm not giving it to you, she said. Then you're a fool. Caldwell's voice hardened. That gold belonged to me. Victor stole it, and I've waited 40 years to get it back. It's evidence now. The FBI is on their way. A pause. Then Caldwell laughed a bitter, hollow sound. You think the FBI will help you? You think anyone cares about justice after all this time? Margaret opened the door. She stood in the threshold, the crowbar at her side, and looked Caldwell in the eyes. This house has already taken too much, she said quietly. You're not taking anything else. Caldwell stared at her. Then he smiled. We'll see about that. Caldwell took a step forward. Margaret didn't move. Behind her, somewhere in the house, she heard sirens. Caldwell heard them too. His expression hardened. You called them? Yes. You stupid woman. You have no idea what you've done. Margaret's grip tightened on the crowbar. I know exactly what I've done. The sirens grew louder, closer. 2 FBI vehicles pulled into the driveway, followed by local police. Agents stepped out, hands on their holsters, eyes locked on Caldwell and his men. Richard Caldwell? One agent called. Caldwell turned slowly, his jaw clenched. I'm Special Agent Morris. We'd like to ask you some questions about trespassing and attempted theft. Caldwell's hands curled into fists. That gold is mine. Victor Ashwood stole it from me 40 years ago. Then you can explain that to us. Downtown. Agent Morris gestured to the other agents. Secure the scene. Caldwell looked back at Margaret one last time. His eyes were cold, bitter. You're a fool, he said quietly. That gold could have changed your life. Margaret met his gaze. It already has. They took him away. The FBI worked through the afternoon, cataloging the gold, photographing the safe, documenting everything Margaret showed them, Catherine's journal, Thomas's letter, Victor's ledgers. Agent Morris sat with Margaret in the kitchen, taking her statement. Your husband was trying to expose this, he said, reading Thomas's letter again. He knew what Victor Ashwood was doing. Yes. And you believe his death wasn't accidental? Margaret nodded. His brakes failed 2 days after being serviced. I didn't question it then. I should have. Morris made notes. We'll reopen the case. If there's evidence of foul play, we'll find it. Margaret's throat tightened. Thank you. Morris looked at her carefully. Mrs. Hartley, you understand that by turning this over, you're forfeiting any claim to the gold. I understand. No finder's fee, no reward. It'll be liquidated and returned to the victims of Ashwood's fraud. Whatever's left will go to the government. That's what should happen. Morris studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. Not many people would make that choice. My husband did. Yes, Morris said quietly. He did. By evening, the FBI was gone. The gold, the documents, the journal, all of it taken as evidence. The safe stood empty, its door hanging open like a mouth that had finally exhaled. Margaret stood in Emily's room, staring at the hollow space where the fortune had been. She felt lighter. Not happy, not relieved. Just lighter. As if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. She walked to the window and looked out at the overgrown grounds. The light was fading, painting everything in shades of amber and gray. That's when she noticed it. Beneath the peeling wallpaper near the window frame, something was carved into the wood. Margaret peeled the paper back carefully. Letters. Small, careful. Emily's garden. Forever loved. Margaret's breath caught. She looked out the window again, toward the reflecting pool. It was barely visible beneath the weeds and vines, but she could see the outline now, a rectangular shape, stone-edged, filled with overgrowth. And beyond it, barely visible, the remnants of what had once been a garden. Margaret left the room and walked outside. The air was cool, heavy with salt and the scent of earth. Margaret made her way through the tall grass to the reflecting pool. It was smaller than she'd imagined, shallow, filled with stagnant water and moss. But around it, half buried beneath years of neglect, were the remains of a garden. Stone borders, the stumps of rose bushes, a small wooden sign, rotted and fallen, with faint letters still visible. Emily's garden. Margaret knelt beside it, her hands trembling. This was where Emily had died. And this was where Catherine had tried to preserve her memory. Not with gold, not with secrets, with flowers. Margaret pulled the weeds away gently, revealing the stone borders, the shape of the beds. She could see it now, what it had been, what it could be again. And she understood. The real treasure wasn't in the safe. It was here, in the chance to honor a child's memory, to give the Ashwood family the closure they'd never had, to finish what Catherine couldn't. Margaret stood slowly, looking at the garden. Then she looked back at the mansion, at the house that had held so much pain and so many secrets. And for the first time since Thomas died, she didn't feel hollow. She felt purpose. That night, Margaret sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars emerge over the ocean. Her phone buzzed. A text from David Ashwood. Agent Morris called. Said you gave them everything. Thank you. For my sister. For my family. Thank you. Margaret smiled faintly and typed back. It was the right thing to do. She set the phone down and looked at the photograph of Thomas she'd brought outside with her. You tried to stop it, she whispered, and I finished it. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of salt and pine. And in that moment, Margaret could almost hear his voice. You did the right thing. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not from grief, from peace. 6 months later, the mansion looked like it had taken a breath and remembered how to live. Margaret stood on the front porch, watching cars pull into the circular driveway. The paint was fresh, the windows repaired, the vines trimmed back to reveal the elegant bones of the architecture beneath. Ashwood Estate had been transformed, but not into what it was, into what it was meant to become. Inside, the rooms hummed with quiet activity. The ground floor had been converted into a community center meeting spaces, a small library, a room where local artists displayed their work. The second floor housed a museum dedicated to the Ashwood family's story, told with honesty and compassion. And in Emily's room, now a memorial space, Catherine's journal sat under glass, opened to the final entry. Let anyone who finds it carry the weight we carried. Beside it, a photograph of Emily, smiling in her garden. Margaret had funded the restoration with her savings and a grant from a historical preservation society. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She didn't need a fortune. She needed purpose. And she'd found it. David Ashwood arrived just before noon. He'd aged since Margaret last saw him, but his eyes were clearer now, less burdened. They walked through the mansion together, stopping in each room. When they reached Emily's memorial, David stood quietly, reading the inscription on the wall. Emily Catherine Ashwood, 1,971 1,978, forever loved. My mother would have wanted this, he said softly. Something beautiful, something that honored her. Margaret nodded. I hope it helps. David turned to her. You gave my family's story a dignified ending. You could have kept the gold. No one would have blamed you. But you didn't. He paused. Thank you. Margaret's throat tightened. Your sister deserved to be remembered, not buried. They stood there in silence, two people connected by grief and the choice to heal it. Outside, the garden was blooming. Margaret had spent months restoring it, clearing the weeds, replanting the beds, repairing the stone borders around the reflecting pool. The pool itself was filled now, clear and still, reflecting the sky. And around it, roses bloomed. White and pink and yellow, just like the photographs from 1978. Children played on the lawn, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Margaret sat on a bench at the garden's edge, watching them. She thought about Catherine, who had created this garden as a memorial and then abandoned it in her grief. She thought about Thomas, who had tried to do the right thing and paid for it with his life. And she thought about herself, the woman who had bought a crumbling mansion because she couldn't bear to stay in a house haunted by absence. She'd been running from grief, but in the end, she'd run straight into healing. Agent Morris had called 2 weeks ago. The FBI had confirmed it. Thomas's death hadn't been an accident. Brake lines had been tampered with. The investigation pointed to an associate of Victor Ashwood's, a man who died in 1995, taking the truth with him. But the evidence was enough. Thomas's name had been cleared, his integrity restored. And Margaret had been able to visit his grave and finally say the words she'd needed to say. "You were right, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Margaret walked to the terrace overlooking the ocean. The light painted everything gold, the water, the cliffs, the garden below. She pulled Thomas's photograph from her pocket and looked at it one last time. His smile, his kind eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for leading me here." She didn't know if she was thanking Thomas, or Catherine, or Emily, or the house itself. Maybe it didn't matter. Some journeys didn't have clear beginnings or endings. They just found new ways to carry you forward. Margaret tucked the photograph back into her pocket and looked out at the garden. The children were still playing, their laughter bright against the fading light. And for the first time since Thomas died, Margaret didn't feel the weight of grief pressing against her chest. She felt light. She felt whole. She felt home. The mansion stood behind her, no longer haunted by secrets, but alive with memory and meaning. And as the last light faded over the ocean, Margaret smiled. She hadn't found fortune in that safe. She'd found something far more valuable. She'd found herself. $80 million sat in that safe for 40 years, waiting to be claimed. But the real treasure was never the gold. It was the choice between who we are and who we could become. Margaret walked away with empty hands and a full heart, proving that the richest inheritance is integrity, and the only fortune worth keeping is the one you give away.